Most people think they know World War II. They picture massive battleships shooting at each other from miles away. They think about D-Day and the invasion of Normandy. They think about air raids destroying cities. They think about soldiers marching across Europe. But here's what they don't tell you about the war at sea. Some of the most dangerous and weirdest attacks didn't happen the way you'd expect. They weren't part of the big famous battles that everyone learns about in school. They were smaller operations, more creative operations. Operations that required people to think outside the box and come up with solutions that nobody had ever tried before. During World War II, soldiers dressed up as local fishermen and attacked German coastal positions. Submarines were used as taxis to transport commandos behind enemy lines. Kayaks were turned into weapons to sink naval vessels. Ships were packed with explosives and used as floating bombs. And some of these raids worked so well that they completely changed how naval warfare actually happened, not just during World War II, but for decades after. Modern navies are still using tactics that were invented out of desperation during this war. Modern military forces still train soldiers to do the exact same things that these commandos did. Today, we're looking at 10 naval raids from World War II that almost nobody talks about. These weren't the famous operations like Midway or the Coral Sea. These were the ones that made German and Japanese admirals lose sleep at night because they realized how vulnerable their ships really were, how vulnerable their supply lines really were, how vulnerable their coastal positions really were. Some of these stories sound so crazy that you'd think somebody made them up for a movie. You'd think they were too dramatic to be real. But they actually happened. They actually occurred. And they changed everything about how countries protect their fleets and how militaries think about warfare. Let's start with the first one, and this is a story about desperation and innovation. This story is set in the Mediterranean Sea in 1941, during one of the darkest periods of the war for the British. The British didn't always have massive fleets, ready to go and available for every mission. By 1941, they were getting pushed back all over the place. They were losing battles. They were losing ships. They were losing soldiers. The Mediterranean was a nightmare for them. German and Italian warships were attacking British ships. German and Italian planes were bombing British positions. German and Italian submarines were sinking cargo boats that were trying to reach Malta. Malta was this tiny island that the British controlled, but it was surrounded by enemy territory on all sides. The British base there was starving. Food was running out. Fuel was running out. Medicine was running out. People were dying from lack of supplies. Soldiers were getting sick because they didn't have proper food. Pilots couldn't fly missions because there was no fuel for the planes. The whole situation was absolutely desperate. The British military leadership realized they had a choice. They could either abandon Malta or they could figure out a way to get supplies through. Abandoning Malta meant losing a strategic position in the Mediterranean. It meant losing the ability to attack German and Italian supply lines. It meant losing control of the sea. But trying to get supplies through seemed impossible. The route to Malta was completely controlled by the enemy. Every ship that tried to make the journey got attacked. Most of them got sunk. So the British came up with something nobody had really tried before. They called it Operation Harpoon. It was a radical idea, a desperate idea. But sometimes desperate times require desperate measures. Here's what they did. They took regular cargo ships, nothing special about them. No advanced weapons, no special armor, just old merchant vessels that had been used to carry supplies all over the world before the war. They loaded them up with supplies for Malta: food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, spare parts. Everything the base needed to stay alive and keep operating. But here's the crazy part. They didn't send these ships with a huge Navy escort like you'd normally do. They didn't send 10 battleships and 20 destroyers to protect them. Instead, they sent them with fast cruisers and destroyers that were supposed to run in, drop off the supplies, and run out before anyone could stop them. The whole idea was based on speed, on moving so fast that the enemy couldn't catch them. It sounds simple when you say it like that, but it was incredibly dangerous. The convoy had to pass through waters that were completely controlled by the Germans and Italians. There were German planes based in Sicily, Italian planes based in Sicily and Libya, German submarines somewhere underwater that you couldn't see, Italian submarines too, German and Italian ships patrolling the sea, anti-aircraft positions on islands. It was basically running a gauntlet of death, a corridor where everything wanted to kill you. The main supply ship was called the USS Quincy, and it was American, even though the British were the ones running the operation. The Americans were helping the British with supplies by this point in the war. When the Quincy got close to Sicily, everything went wrong all at once. I mean, the Germans and Italians really came at it. Planes dropping bombs from above, ships shooting from the surface. Submarines somewhere in the water trying to get into position to fire torpedoes. The whole thing was absolute chaos, complete madness. The captain of the Quincy had to make split-second decisions. He had to dodge explosions while trying to keep the ship moving toward Malta. He had to watch his navigation instruments to make sure they were going the right direction through the chaos. He had to make decisions about which way to turn to avoid bombs, which way to steer to avoid shells, and all around him, other ships in the convoy were getting hit. He could see explosions lighting up the night sky. He could see other ships going down into the water. He could see sailors in the water drowning. But he had to keep going. He couldn't stop. Stopping meant the ship would be an easy target. Stopping meant certain death. The captain ordered the ship to go faster. The engines screamed. The ship was old and wasn't designed to go this fast, but the crew pushed it beyond what it was supposed to do. The German and Italian commanders kept throwing everything they had at the convoy. More planes, more ships, more submarines. They were determined to stop this convoy. They knew how important it was to prevent supplies from reaching Malta. But then something happened that people didn't expect. The British and American ships were just too fast. The destroyers and cruisers were moving at speeds that the German and Italian ships couldn't match. They were moving at 40 miles per hour, 50 miles per hour. The German and Italian ships could only go maybe 35, so they just kept getting left behind. The Quincy, even though it was a cargo ship and not built for speed, was faster than most of the enemy warships that were trying to stop it. Because all that extra speed the crew squeezed out of the engines was enough. It was like watching a running back in football break through the line and run for a touchdown. The ship had to dodge left, dodge right, dodge left again. Explosions going off all around, shells flying past, bombs hitting the water nearby and creating massive geysers of water. And somehow, the captain made it work. The Quincy made it through and reached Malta. The ship dropped off the supplies. Malta was saved for a little while. People had food again. Pilots had fuel. The base could keep operating. Soldiers could keep fighting. The mission was a success. It sounds almost too simple when you say it like that. But this operation proved something really important to the military leaders who were watching it. You don't always need a giant battle to win. You don't always need to sink the enemy's ships. Sometimes speed and timing matter way more than firepower. Sometimes the best defense is moving fast enough that the enemy can't hit you. When you're too fast to catch, you're almost impossible to stop. The Germans and Italians learned that their defensive system wasn't foolproof. They learned that ships could get through if they were fast enough and if they timed it right. This raid changed how people thought about moving supplies through dangerous waters. Other navies started copying the idea. You could send ships through hostile areas if they were fast enough. If you timed it right, if you had good intelligence about where the enemy ships were, if you knew when the enemy would be least prepared. It wasn't foolproof. Sometimes it failed. But it worked more often than people thought it would, and it saved lives. Supplies got through. People didn't starve. Soldiers could continue fighting. This one operation created a whole new type of military tactic that's still used today. Fast insertion, drop off supplies or troops, and fast extraction. And get in and get out before the enemy knows what's happening. Now the second one is where things get really weird, and this one happened in the English Channel in 1942, during the period when the Germans were occupying France. During the war, the British military realized something important. They realized that if they could get soldiers behind enemy lines and destroy important military stuff without fighting a massive battle, that would be absolutely amazing. They could hurt the enemy's ability to fight without having to match them, ship for ship or gun for gun. They could do targeted strikes, precise strikes. They could destroy specific targets that would have a big impact on the enemy's war effort. So the British created the Special Operations Executive. These were basically the British version of special forces, but for water operations. They trained people to do crazy things in boats and submarines. They trained them to be sneaky, to be fast, to be deadly. They called these units the Small-Scale Raiding Force. The name doesn't sound scary, but these guys were terrifying to German commanders because they kept showing up in places where German commanders thought they were safe, where they thought they were protected. One of their most insane operations happened in 1942. The British wanted to mess with the German Navy in the English Channel. They wanted to destroy some of the equipment and supplies that the Germans had stationed along the coast. So they put together a raid where they would attack a German coastal position. The target was a supply depot. The Germans had ammunition stored there. They had fuel. They had food. They had spare parts. But here's the thing that makes this raid so interesting. They decided to use an old fishing boat, an actual fishing boat. They had captured it from the French, or borrowed it somehow, and they disguised it so it looked like a normal French vessel. German patrols saw fishing boats all the time. Fishing boats coming and going. Fishermen going out to catch fish and then coming back with their catch. Nobody thought anything of it. Nobody was suspicious of fishing boats. The British soldiers dressed up like French fishermen. They wore the right clothes. They had the right accents. They even had fake fishing nets and everything. They practiced their French so much that they could fool anyone who heard them talking. They practiced the mannerisms. They practiced how to act like a tired fisherman who just wants to catch some fish and go home. They sailed right up to the coast where the Germans had set up a little base. There were guards and fortifications, ammunition storage, supplies for the troops stationed there. Machine gun, nests. Everything set up to defend against attack. When they got close enough, when they were right in front of the German position, they stopped pretending to be fishermen. The soldiers jumped out of the boat with guns and explosives. They had grenades. They had rifles. They had machine guns. They had everything they needed to cause serious damage. They hit the German position so hard and so fast that the Germans didn't even have time to call for help or get organized enough to mount a real defense. The alarm was raised, but by then, it was too late. The British soldiers were already everywhere. The whole attack took maybe 15 or 20 minutes. The British guys destroyed a bunch of supplies, blew up the ammunition storage. They killed some soldiers. They set fires. They blew up buildings. The ammunition storage went up in a huge explosion that lit up the night sky. They were professional and quick. They knew exactly what they were doing because they had trained for it. They had planned it. They had studied the target. They knew where everything was. Then they got back to the boat and started leaving. By the time German reinforcements could show up, the fishing boat was already speeding away from the coast. The Germans shot at them, but they were too far away by then. The bullets weren't hitting anything. The boat disappeared into the darkness. What makes this raid so interesting is that it shows how low-tech solutions sometimes worked better than you'd think. Nobody was expecting soldiers to dress up as fishermen and attack from the sea. The Germans had their big guns pointed out at the ocean, waiting for real warships. They had their defenses set up to fight a naval battle or defend against an air raid. They weren't ready for a fishing boat full of soldiers with explosives. The surprise was total. The Germans were completely caught off guard. These raiding operations kept happening all through the war. Different places, different targets, but the same idea. Move fast, hit hard, get out before the enemy knows what happened. The raids happened in the English Channel. They happened in the Mediterranean. They happened in Norway. They happened wherever the Germans had coastal bases. German command started getting paranoid about every boat near their coastline. They had to station more and more soldiers everywhere just to protect against these random attacks. More soldiers on the coast meant fewer soldiers available to fight somewhere else. Fewer soldiers available to defend against invasion. The British were messing with the Germans' heads without really having to win big battles. They were tying down German military resources without direct combat. The third raid is one that almost nobody knows about, but it's insane. And it happened in 1943 in the Mediterranean near Sicily during the invasion of Sicily. In 1943, the British and Americans were working together in North Africa. They had invaded North Africa and were pushing the Germans and Italians out. The Italians and Germans had control of a lot of the coast, but there was this harbour in Sicily that had German and Italian ships in it. Important ships. Ships that were being used to supply German and Italian troops. ships that could fight back if the Allies tried to invade. If these ships got destroyed, a lot of supplies wouldn't reach the soldiers. The troops would be cut off. They would have no ammunition, no food, no way to fight back effectively. The problem was that the harbor was super protected. There were anti-aircraft guns everywhere pointing up at the sky, waiting for planes, boats in the water ready to defend, soldiers on the beaches, machine gun nests, everything you could think of to defend the harbor. It was basically a fortress floating in water. You couldn't just sail in there with a regular naval force and attack. The enemy would see you coming from miles away and start shooting. You'd lose ships, you'd lose sailors, you'd probably fail anyway. You couldn't use planes to bomb it because it was surrounded by so many anti-aircraft guns that the planes would just get shot down. You'd lose pilots and planes for nothing. You'd send young men to die for a mission that wouldn't accomplish anything. You couldn't use submarines because submarines work best when they can hide, and a submarine firing torpedoes in a crowded harbor would just get attacked by every ship in the area. It was basically impossible to attack using any normal method of warfare. So the Allies came up with a plan that sounds like science fiction. They used a submarine. But not to shoot torpedoes at the ships. They wanted to use the submarine to carry commandos. These were special soldiers who were trained for dangerous missions. These soldiers would go underwater and then swim to the harbor. Once they got there, they would attach explosives to the enemy ships. The explosives would have a timer so they could escape before the ships blew up. It was basically like the submarine was a taxi that took soldiers to a place where they could cause trouble and change the course of the war. The submarine got as close as it could to the harbor without being detected. The captain had to be really careful because if the Germans or Italians saw the submarine, they'd start attacking it immediately. Depth charges would rain down on the submarine. The submarine would have to dive deep or run away. But if the submarine was too far away, the soldiers wouldn't be able to swim to the harbor in the time they had. They'd run out of oxygen. They'd get exhausted. They'd have to give up. So the captain had to find this perfect balance. Close enough but not too close. Close enough to give the soldiers a chance, but far enough away to keep the submarine safe. Once the submarine was in position, the commandos got into their diving gear. They had oxygen tanks so they could breathe underwater. They had wetsuits so they wouldn't freeze in the cold water. They had explosives and timers and tools, everything they needed to attach the explosives to ships. Then they jumped out of the submarine into the cold water. The hatch closed behind them. They were alone, completely alone in the dark water. There's nothing scarier than swimming in the ocean toward an enemy harbor at night. You can't see anything. Visibility is maybe 10 feet if you're lucky. You don't know if somebody spotted you. You're trying to swim quietly, but every movement feels loud, even though nobody can hear you underwater. You're moving through black water. Your heart is pounding. You're thinking about all the things that could go wrong. You could get caught. You could run out of oxygen. Your equipment could break. A boat could run you over. You could get lost and swim the wrong direction. You could panic. You're thinking about all of this while you're swimming through the dark toward an enemy position. But somehow, these guys made it. They swam all the way to the ships without being detected. They snuck up on the enemy vessels without being spotted. In the darkness, moving slowly and carefully, they swam right up to the hulls of the ships. Then they attached the explosives to the ships. They set the timers. They worked quickly but carefully. Any mistake could alert the guards. Then they swam back to where the submarine was supposed to be. Their oxygen was running low. Their bodies were exhausted. But they made it. They got back to the submarine. The hatch opened. They climbed inside. They were safe. When those explosives went off, they sank some of the enemy ships without firing a single shot or dropping a single bomb. No one fired a gun. No one dropped a bomb. The ships just started sinking. The Italians and Germans woke up to find their ships at the bottom of the harbor. Some of them had gone down during the night without any warning. The sailors didn't even know what happened. They were asleep below deck when the explosives went off. The ships filled with water and sank. It was like the ships were attacked by ghosts. Nobody saw the attackers. Nobody saw what was happening. The ships were just gone. This operation showed that you could use submarines in ways that nobody had really thought about before. Submarines became this weird hybrid weapon that could do transportation, reconnaissance, and attack all in one mission. A submarine could carry soldiers to a place where they needed to be drop them off, wait for them to do their job, and then pick them up and bring them home. It was revolutionary. It changed how people thought about submarines. After this, more and more naval operations started using submarines to get soldiers behind enemy lines. Submarines became taxis for commandos, and it worked. The fourth one happened in the Baltic Sea in 1944, and it's one of the most brutal ones we're going to talk about today. By 1944, the war was turning. The Soviets were pushing west across Europe. They had won at Stalingrad. They were winning on land. The Germans knew they were losing, but they weren't going to give up. They had a huge naval presence in the Baltic Sea. These ships were protecting German soldiers and civilians who were trying to escape Soviet territory. They were protecting supply lines. They were the last lifeline for German forces in the north. Without these ships, the soldiers would be cut off. The civilians would be captured. Everything would be lost. So the Soviets wanted to destroy as many German ships as they could. They wanted to cripple the German Navy. They wanted to make it impossible for the Germans to move supplies or evacuate people. The Soviets came up with this idea to use small boats loaded with explosives. These weren't sophisticated weapons or anything. They were basically just boats packed with TNT. The Soviets would build these boats. Sometimes they would put a pilot inside to steer them toward the target. Sometimes they would send them out unmanned, basically remote-controlled, or just pointed toward where they wanted them to go. The Soviets would send these boats straight at German ships. It was basically suicide missions. If the pilot was inside, they had to jump out right before impact and try to swim to safety. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the water was too cold, and they died anyway. Sometimes German ships spotted them and opened fire, shooting them out of the water before they could reach their target. These attacks worked, though. German ships that were protecting important supply routes got destroyed. Ships sank. Soldiers were stranded. Supplies couldn't get through. Soldiers on shore had to fight without ammunition or food. The problem for the Germans was that they couldn't stop these attacks. They were too random. You couldn't predict where the next one was coming from. So the Germans had to spread their navy out more and more just to protect themselves against small boats loaded with explosives. That made their defensive lines even weaker. They had to patrol more territory with fewer ships. This is one of the first times in naval history that a really small, cheap weapon caused a massive problem for a way more powerful navy. It's kind of like what happens in modern warfare too. You do not need an expensive fighter jet to mess with an aircraft carrier if you're creative about how you attack it. Sometimes a small boat is enough. Sometimes creativity beats money. Sometimes desperation leads to innovation. When you have fewer resources, you have to think differently. You have to figure out how to do more with less. The Germans were using their naval forces to protect supply lines and evacuate people. The Soviets were using small boats and submarines to sink those ships. It was asymmetrical. Warfare before anybody even had a name for it. The side that had fewer resources was forcing the side with more resources to spread themselves thinner and thinner until they couldn't protect anything anymore. Until their system broke down. Until they couldn't accomplish their objectives anymore. The Japanese had their own version of this kind of attack, and that's the fifth one we need to talk about, and it happened in the Pacific in 1943 and 1944. The Japanese knew they were losing the war by 1943. They had way fewer ships than they started with, way fewer pilots, way fewer resources. Their factories couldn't build ships fast enough to replace the ones they were losing. Their training programs couldn't train pilots fast enough to replace the ones who died. Young pilots were flying missions with only a few weeks of training instead of months or years. They were bleeding resources constantly. Every battle meant losses. Every loss meant they got weaker. So they started getting desperate. They came up with something called the kamikaze attacks, but those were planes. Pilots would fly planes straight at American ships and crash into them deliberately, sacrificing their lives for the mission. What a lot of people don't know is that the Japanese also did kamikaze attacks with boats. They called them Shinyo boats. These were basically the Japanese version of the Soviet suicide boats, except they were a lot more advanced. They were built by the Japanese military, not just some improvised weapon. They were fast wooden boats loaded with explosives. A pilot would drive one of these things straight at an American ship and jump out right before crashing into it. The impact would trigger the explosives, and boom, the ship gets hit. Hopefully the ship sinks, or at least gets damaged so badly that it has to pull out of service for repairs. The hope was that if you sank enough ships, eventually the Americans would have to stop what they were doing. The problem was that these boats were slow compared to what the Americans had. American PT boats were faster, American destroyers were faster, American cruisers were faster, and they weren't very well armored. American soldiers could see them coming from pretty far away and shoot them with machine guns from quite a distance. You could just pump bullets into a Chariot boat and blow it up before it got close to your ship. Most of these attacks didn't work, but some of them did, and that was enough to make the Americans nervous. The scary thing about Chariot boats was what they represented. The Japanese were so desperate that they were willing to send young pilots on suicide missions in boats. They knew most of them would die, but they did it anyway because they felt like they had no other choice. The pilots were essentially living weapons, disposable weapons. It shows how different the war at sea became by the middle of 1943. Countries were doing stuff that would have seemed impossible a few years earlier. Stuff that violated everything people thought about naval warfare. Stuff that was suicidal but done anyway because surrender wasn't an option. What's weird is that the Chariot boats actually inspired the Allies to think about faster, smaller boats themselves. By the end of the war, every navy had these fast attack boats. They weren't suicide weapons necessarily, but they were fast enough to get in, hit something, and get out before a bigger ship could respond. They could carry weapons. They could carry commandos. They could do reconnaissance. They changed what a small navy could do against a big navy. They showed that speed and maneuverability could be just as important as size and firepower. The 6th raid happened in Norway in 1943 and involved one of the weirdest weapons ever made. And this one is about something that people definitely have heard of, but probably don't know about the naval part. The Germans had this heavy water facility in Norway. Heavy water is used to make nuclear stuff, and the Nazis were interested in nuclear weapons. If the Germans made the bomb before anyone else, the war was over. The Allies lose, America loses, Britain loses, Europe loses, everyone loses. The whole war changes. So the Allies decided they had to destroy this facility. But it was way up in the mountains. You couldn't get to it by sea. You had to go overland. You had to hike up into the mountains through snow and cold to find this facility. You had to climb. You had to walk. You had to carry equipment. It was incredibly difficult to reach. But here's where the naval part comes in. The Allies put commandos on boats and sent them up a Norwegian fjord. A fjord is basically a deep valley that fills with water. These were soldiers who were trained for this kind of stuff. They were special forces. They knew how to fight in the mountains. They knew how to use explosives. They knew how to move silently. When they got as far as they could by water, they jumped out of the boats and ran up the mountain to the heavy water facility. They carried their equipment. They carried their weapons. They carried their explosives. They ran up steep slopes in the snow and the cold. Then they destroyed the facility with explosives and then ran back down to the boats. The whole thing took a few hours. What makes this raid so interesting is that it shows how naval forces were starting to work with land forces in ways that nobody had really done before. You couldn't just attack the facility from the sea. You couldn't bomb it from the air because the pilots would just crash into the mountains. You had to get soldiers to the location. So you combined a sea approach with land combat. You used boats to get soldiers to where they needed to be. Then they did the actual fighting. It was one of the first times that a naval raid turned into a mini-invasion. It was one of the first times that boats were used specifically to transport soldiers to do land-based missions. This idea became way more common later in the war. Marines would ride boats to a beach and then jump off and start fighting. Soldiers would ride in landing craft to an island and then storm ashore. It's kind of normal now when you think about it. But back then, it was really new. The British and Americans had to figure out how to do it. They had to figure out what boats to use. They had to figure out how many soldiers they could fit in the boats. They had to figure out how to protect the boats while they were bringing soldiers to the shore. It was all experimentation, trial and error. Some missions worked, some missions failed. The heavy water facility was rebuilt after the raid, and the Allies had to raid it again later. This time they used planes instead of boats. But the first raid showed something important. Sometimes you can use boats to get soldiers to places that seem unreachable, and then they can fight on land. It's like naval transportation became a weapon itself. The boat isn't just a way to move around. The boat is part of your military strategy. The boat is part of how you win the war. The seventh one is from the Pacific, and it's crazy, and it happened in 1942, when the Americans and Japanese were fighting for control of the Solomon Islands. The Americans wanted to get supplies to soldiers who were stuck on an island in the Solomon Islands. The soldiers had landed there as part of the invasion of the Solomon Islands. They were fighting the Japanese hard. They were killing Japanese soldiers. They were taking territory. But they were also running out of food, running out of ammunition, running out of medicine, running out of everything. They needed supplies, or they were going to have to retreat. They needed reinforcements. But the Japanese had ships in the area. They had cruisers and destroyers. They had submarines. So they couldn't send normal cargo ships down the coast. The Japanese would just sink them. You'd lose all the supplies. You'd lose all the sailors. You'd accomplish nothing. The soldiers would still starve. So, the Americans came up with an idea that was kind of crazy. They took fast destroyers, which are military ships that are built for combat, and they loaded them with supplies instead of extra weapons. Instead of being fully armed warships, they became supply ships. Then they sent them to the island at night. They called these supply runs the Rat Run, because the boats would sneak down the coast like rats at night, drop off supplies, and leave. They would move in darkness. They would stay quiet. They would try to avoid being detected. The Japanese saw these ships coming and tried to attack them. They sent their own ships to intercept. They sent planes during the day to try to find them. But here's the thing about destroyers. They're really fast, really well armed. The American destroyers could move at 40 miles per hour or more. They could fight back. They had guns. They had trained crews. So the Americans could fight their way through the Japanese attacks, drop off the supplies, and run away before the Japanese could bring in more ships. It was like a running gun battle in the dark, ships firing at each other, explosions lighting up the night. And then the American destroyers would speed away at full speed. The Japanese couldn't catch up. They couldn't keep pace. The Japanese started calling these supply runs the Rat Run too, and they hated them. They hated that the Americans had figured out how to get supplies through their defense. Every time the Americans did it, supplies got through. Every time the Japanese tried to stop them, they lost ships. Sometimes Japanese ships sank. Sometimes they got damaged so badly that they had to be pulled out of service for repairs and maintenance. The Americans were using military equipment for something it wasn't designed for. A destroyer is supposed to fight other ships. It's supposed to sink submarines. It's not supposed to carry cargo. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. The Americans refined the idea over time. They figured out the best routes. They figured out the best times to do it. They figured out which islands needed supplies the most. The Rat Run became one of the most important supply lines in the entire Pacific War. American soldiers got the supplies they needed. They could keep fighting. They could hold the territory they had taken. They could continue their advance. The reason I'm bringing this up is because it changed how navies thought about supply lines. You don't always need slow cargo ships. Sometimes you can use fast military ships and just fight through the opposition. It's riskier. Your military ship might get damaged and need repairs instead of being ready for combat. But sometimes it's the only way to win. Sometimes you have to take that risk. Sometimes the benefit of getting supplies through is worth the risk of losing a military ship. The 8th raid involves something that seems impossible today, and this happened in France in 1944 during the later stages of the war. In 1944, the Germans had a ship in a French port. The ship was heavily armed and well protected. It was one of their most important vessels. The Allies couldn't use planes to bomb it because it was surrounded by so many anti-aircraft guns that the planes would just get shot down. You'd lose pilots and planes for nothing. They couldn't use normal ships to attack it because the German ship was too well defended. There were fortifications all around the harbor. There were other ships defending it, German soldiers on shore. Everything set up to protect this one ship. You'd get your ships destroyed for nothing. So they came up with something crazy. They loaded an old ship with explosives, like a ton of explosives. More explosives than you'd think a ship could hold. I'm talking thousands and thousands of pounds of TNT. They basically turned the ship into a giant bomb, a floating bomb, a weapon that would detonate on impact. Then they sent it straight at the German ship on a collision course. The two ships were going to crash into each other. Right before impact, the soldiers running the bomb ship jumped into a small boat and paddled away as fast as they could. They had minutes to get away before the collision. Minutes to escape. The ship crashed into the German vessel, and then the explosives went off. The explosion was so big and so powerful that it damaged the German ship really badly, maybe even sank it. The explosion lit up the sky. It could be seen from miles away. This raid actually inspired a real piece of military history that people do know about. It showed that you could sacrifice a ship to destroy an enemy ship if you packed it with enough explosives. It's brutal, but it works. Later in the war, this idea got more sophisticated. People started building ships specifically designed to be floating bombs. They called them fire ships in some cases, bringing back an old naval tradition from centuries earlier. You'd fill them with explosives or fuel or anything flammable and send them at the enemy. It was basically medieval tactics combined with modern explosives. The Ninth Raid is one of the smallest ones, but it had one of the biggest impacts, and this happened in 1942 and 1943 in Europe during coastal operations. In 1942, a British officer came up with an idea. His name wasn't super important, but his idea was brilliant and terrifying. He wanted to train soldiers to use kayaks as weapons, not to sit in the kayak and paddle around like you're on vacation or going fishing, actually to use the kayak itself as a way to sneak up on enemy ships and plant explosives on them. The kayak was so quiet and so small that ships wouldn't even see it coming. A kayak is basically invisible if you're not looking for it. It moves silently through the water. It doesn't have an engine. It doesn't have a radio. It doesn't have lights. It doesn't make noise. It's just a boat and a person paddling. These guys trained for months and months. They learned how to paddle silently, how to move through the water without making noise, how to attach explosives to ships, how to escape after planting the bombs, how to navigate at night using only stars and landmarks. They practiced over and over and over. They did it in different weather conditions. They did it when it was cold. They did it when it was dark. They did it when they were tired. They wanted to make sure that they could do it no matter what, that they could do it in any condition, that they could complete the mission even if things went wrong. Then they went out on their first real mission. They paddled right up to a German ship that was parked in a harbor, attached the explosives, and paddled away. When the explosives went off, the ship sank, just like that. The ship went down. It was gone. The Germans didn't even know what happened. They thought maybe it was a mine that they hadn't noticed. They thought maybe there was something wrong with the ship structurally. They didn't think it was kayaks. Who thinks kayaks? What's wild is that this actually worked several times. Soldiers in kayaks would sneak up to enemy ships and destroy them without anyone even knowing what happened. The ships would just sink. For a while, the Germans thought they were being attacked by ghosts or something. Their ships were disappearing. There was no explanation. They couldn't figure out who was doing it. It was driving them absolutely crazy. They were losing ships, and they couldn't understand why or how. Eventually, the Germans figured it out. They started putting guards on the shore near where ships were parked. They started putting nets in the water to stop kayaks from getting close. They started doing patrols to look for kayaks. They started posting spotters with binoculars watching the water at night. But by then, the kayak units had already proven their point. You don't need expensive equipment or giant weapons to destroy a ship. You don't need a battleship or a submarine or a plane. You need speed, silence, and timing. A kayak was basically free compared to a plane or a destroyer. The cost was almost nothing. But it was incredibly effective if you had soldiers who were willing to risk their lives. The kayak raids inspired other navies to think about small, stealthy approaches to warfare. Later in the war and after the war, militaries started developing other small boats and submarines. They started thinking about how to do more damage with less stuff. The kayak soldiers basically invented a whole new type of naval warfare. Today, Special forces still use kayaks and small boats to approach targets. Navy SEALs train extensively with kayaks. Modern militaries still use the tactics that were invented by these crazy British soldiers paddling in the dark. The 10th and final raid is one of the most important ones because it actually changed how navies operated after the war, and this is a story about hunting and precision and persistence. In 1943, a German submarine in the Mediterranean sank a ship carrying a lot of supplies. The ship went down so fast that most of the soldiers on it died. The ones who survived were floating in the water, waiting for rescue. They were calling for help. They were trying to stay alive in the bow. They proved that the most powerful weapon isn't always a gun or a ship or a plane. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is an idea. Sometimes it's knowing how to think like your enemy. Sometimes it's understanding that what your enemy expects can become your greatest advantage. They expected a fishing boat to be a fishing boat. They got soldiers instead. That simple expectation, that simple surprise, gave the British the edge they needed to win. The submarine commandos who swam into enemy harbors proved something too. They proved that humans can do incredible things when they are trained properly and when they have the right motivation. A person swimming in cold, dark water toward an enemy ship should be terrified. They should give up. But they didn't. They completed their mission. They came back alive. That's not just bravery. That's the result of training and planning and trust in your team. That's what happens when you prepare people properly. The kayak soldiers proved that size doesn't matter. A kayak is tiny. It's vulnerable. It should be easy to defend against. But in the hands of trained soldiers who know how to be silent and how to move, a kayak becomes a weapon. It becomes something powerful. It becomes something that can sink a ship. That's a lesson that applies to a lot of things. Small doesn't mean weak. Small can mean efficient. Small can mean effective. Small can mean creative. The destroyer captains who ran supplies down the coast at night proved that speed can be a defense. If you move fast enough, you can move through hostile territory. You can accomplish your mission before the enemy can react. Modern militaries use this lesson all the time. Fighter jets fly fast. Submarines move fast when they need to. Attack helicopters show up fast and leave fast. The idea came from those destroyer captains running supplies in the dark Pacific trying to save their fellow soldiers. The German submarine captain who was hunted down proved something else. He proved that eventually, persistence pays off. The American boats didn't give up. They tracked him for days. They didn't lose interest. They didn't decide it was too hard. They kept going, and they got him. That persistence is something that shows up in modern military doctrine. You hunt your enemy, you don't stop, you don't give up. You follow them until you win. All of these lessons came from people who didn't have a lot of time to think. They had to figure things out fast. They had to make decisions with incomplete information. They had to trust their training and their instincts, and most importantly, they had to trust the people next to them. Every single one of these raids required teamwork, required trust, required people believing in each other. When you're in a kayak in the dark heading toward a ship, you have to trust that your team has prepared you properly. You have to trust that they have your back. You have to trust that if something goes wrong, they will help you. That's actually the biggest legacy of these raids. It's not the tactics themselves. It's not the specific weapons or the specific strategies. It's the proof that small teams of dedicated people can do incredible things. That's why every military in the world now has special forces. That's why every navy has commandos. That's why every country trains elite soldiers. Because World War II proved that these units work. These units can accomplish missions that larger forces can't. These units can change the course of battles. Think about the training that modern soldiers go through. Navy SEALs have to learn to do basically everything that these World War II soldiers did. They have to learn to use submarines. They have to learn to use boats. They have to learn to fight on land and in the water. They have to learn to attack from the sea. They have to learn to move silently. They have to learn to work as a team. They have to learn underwater demolition. They have to learn navigation. They have to learn survival skills. Where did all of that come from? It came from these raids. It came from people in World War II figuring out what worked and what didn't. When you watch the news and you see a story about special forces doing something impressive, think about these raids. Think about how that capability came from people who invented it out of necessity during a war. These soldiers were part of nations that were fighting for their survival. They couldn't afford to fail. They had to figure out how to win with what they had. And the solutions they figured out became the foundation for military doctrine for decades, for generations, for the entire modern military structure. The reason these raids are so important is because they came at a time when everything was changing. The world was changing, technology was changing, the way wars were fought was changing. Military strategies didn't work anymore. Big battleships couldn't solve every problem. Massive armies couldn't win without support. So people had to think differently. They had to be creative. And that creativity led to innovations that we still use today. If you take one thing away from this, take this. History isn't just about what happened a long time ago. History is about how people solved problems. History is about how people adapted when things didn't work. History is about innovation under pressure. These World War II raids are examples of that. People faced impossible situations and they figured out how to win. They figured out ways to do things that nobody had done before. And in doing that, they changed the world. They changed how warfare works. They changed how militaries are organized. They changed what's possible. The next time you read about military operations or technology or strategy, look for the connection to these raids. Look for the connection to people who had to figure things out fast. Cold water. They were holding on to pieces of wreckage. But here's what happened next. A German plane flew over and started shooting at the survivors. The plane came down low and started machine gunning the soldiers in the water. They were just killing soldiers in the water, killing helpless men who couldn't fight back. American sailors couldn't believe what they were seeing. They couldn't believe that someone would do that. The Geneva Convention said you had to rescue survivors. You had to treat them humanely. But this German plane didn't care about rules. So the Americans decided to do something about it. They decided that this German submarine had to be found and stopped. They decided that justice had to be served. They sent boats out to hunt that German submarine. This wasn't a big battle. This was a hunt. This was searching for one specific target and pursuing it relentlessly. The American boats tracked the submarine for days and days. The submarine kept running, trying to escape. But the Americans were faster and better equipped, and they were motivated. They had seen what this submarine did to the survivors. Eventually, after days of pursuit, the American boats caught up to it. There was a battle right on the surface. The submarine crew tried to fight back with guns, but they were outgunned. They realized they couldn't win. They couldn't escape. They surrendered. The Americans brought them aboard one of their ships. The American sailors were angry about what they had seen, but they followed the rules of war. They took the prisoners. They didn't hurt them. They brought them to a place where they could be interrogated. What makes this raid so important is that it shows something people don't usually think about. Naval warfare at the end of World War II wasn't just about sinking ships anymore. It was about capturing ships, capturing crew members, and getting intelligence. It was about hunting. It was about precision. It was about small, fast groups working together to find and stop an enemy. It was about information. The Germans who were captured could tell the Allies about other submarines. They could tell them about German tactics. They could tell them where other submarines were supposed to be. They could tell them how to find them. They could tell them how to defeat them. The hunt became as important as the kill. This operation influenced how modern navies work. Today, if you look at how the Navy hunts submarines or tracks ships, it's basically the same idea. Find them, track them, corner them, capture or destroy them. It came from lessons learned during these kinds of raids in World War II. The Navy learned that a small group of dedicated people with good equipment and good training could do as much damage or accomplish as much as a big fleet of ships. A small group could hunt, a small group could find, a small group could stop, a small group could win. All of these raids changed naval warfare forever. Before World War II, people thought naval warfare meant massive battleships shooting at each other from miles away. They thought you needed huge crews and expensive equipment. They thought you needed numbers. They thought quantity was what mattered. But by the end of the war, people realized that sometimes a kayak full of explosives was more effective than a battleship. Sometimes a small group of soldiers was more important than 1,000 regular troops. Sometimes speed and timing and creativity mattered more than raw firepower. Sometimes thinking differently was the key to winning. The Germans and Japanese and Italians were all doing similar things. They all came up with creative ways to attack when they didn't have bigger ships. They all realized that naval warfare was changing. They all had to adapt or die. By the time World War II ended, every major navy had these fast attack boats, special forces units trained for water operations, and submarines that could do way more than just shoot torpedoes. Every navy had learned the lessons that these raiders taught. The effect of these raids goes way beyond World War II. Modern navies still use a lot of the ideas that came out of these operations. Special forces soldiers still use boats to get behind enemy lines. Submarines still carry commandos. Fast attack boats are still a huge part of any navy's arsenal. The tactics that people figured out during these raids are still being used today by the military forces of basically every country with an ocean. The British Royal Marines, the American Navy SEALs, the French Commandos, the Russian Navy, Chinese Navy, Japanese Navy, Korean Navy, Israeli Navy. Everyone is using these tactics that were developed during World War II out of desperation and need. When you look at modern military operations, you see the DNA of these World War II raids everywhere. You see them in the news when a special forces team does something dangerous. You see them in the training that soldiers do. You see them in how navies plan their operations. The kayak raids led to modern submarines that carry commandos. The fishing boat raid led to today's special operations forces. The rat run led to modern amphibious operations. The submarine commandos led to SEAL Team 6 and other elite units. The destroyer supply runs led to amphibious assault ships. Everything traces back. Think about what these raids taught the world. They taught that innovation matters more than tradition. They taught that flexibility matters more than rigid planning. They taught that small teams with a clear objective can accomplish what massive forces can't. These lessons didn't just apply to World War II. They apply to everything that came after. They apply to how businesses work today. They apply to how technology companies solve problems. They apply to how small countries can defend themselves against bigger countries. They apply to life in general. The British Special Forces who raided that German position in a fishing boat proved something. The soldiers and sailors who participated in these raids were ordinary people who did extraordinary things. They weren't all superhero types. They were regular people from regular backgrounds. They were fishermen and farmers and factory workers who became commandos. They were sailors who became underwater demolition experts. They were pilots who became tacticians. They were office workers who became leaders. Regular people put in extraordinary situations did extraordinary things. That's the real story here. Not the weapons, or the tactics, or the strategy. The real story is about human beings pushing themselves to their limits and finding out what they're capable of. But there's something else about these raids that we haven't talked about yet. These raids weren't just military operations. They were moments where regular people made decisions that changed history. They were moments where someone said, "We can do this differently. We can solve this problem in a way nobody has thought of before." And that mentality, that willingness to innovate and adapt, that's what the modern world needs. That's what makes civilization progress. Every single one of these raids started with someone saying, "What if? What if we used a fishing boat instead of a warship? What if we used submarines to transport soldiers instead of just attacking? What if we used kayaks as weapons? What if we used destroyers to carry supplies? What if we packed a ship full of explosives? What if we hunted instead of fought? What if we used speed instead of firepower?" Those what-ifs led to solutions that worked. Solutions that are still being used today. The reason militaries study World War II is because that war was basically a laboratory for warfare. Every nation was experimenting. Every nation was trying new things. Some worked, some didn't. But the ones that worked became doctrine. They became standard practice. They became how you do things. And a lot of the things that work today came from the World War II era, from the desperation, from the innovation, from people who had to figure things out fast. Think about modern special forces operations. When you see Navy SEALs conduct a raid, they're using tactics that trace directly back to these World War II operations. They're using boats to get to their objective. They're using submarines for insertion. They're working in small teams. They're moving fast and hitting hard. They're operating in darkness. They're working with incomplete information. They're trusting their training. They're trusting their team. All of that comes from these raids we talked about. Modern navies are still organized based on lessons learned from World War II. The reason every country has a Navy SEAL team, or the equivalent, is because World War II proved that these teams work, that they're worth the investment, that they can accomplish things that regular military forces can't. Submarines still carry commandos. Fast attack boats are still a crucial part of naval strategy. Special forces units still train in water operations, all because of what happened in World War II. The submarines that carry SEALs today are basically doing what British submarines did in 1943. They're transporting soldiers to a location where they can accomplish a mission. The only difference is that modern submarines are way more advanced. They have better technology. They have better navigation. They have better communication. But the basic idea is the same. Get soldiers to where they need to be, let them do their job, and get them out safely. The fast attack boats that navies use today are basically the descendants of the boats used in the Rat Run. They're faster, they're more heavily armed, they have better engines, they have better navigation systems, but they're still fast boats that can sneak through enemy territory and accomplish a mission. They're still boats that are used to move supplies or soldiers or weapons. They're still boats that can engage in combat if necessary. The idea hasn't changed, the technology has changed, but the idea is the same. The kayak operations that SEALs train for today are directly descended from the kayak raids of World War II. Modern SEALs still train with kayaks. They still learn how to sneak up on targets silently. They still learn how to move through water without being detected. They still learn how to attach explosives to targets. The only difference is that modern explosives are more sophisticated and more reliable. But a SEAL in a kayak in 2024 is doing basically the same thing that a British soldier was doing in a kayak in 1943. Now let's think about what these raids tell us about the nature of innovation and adaptation. During World War II, countries faced problems that they had never faced before. How do you move supplies through enemy territory? How do you attack targets that seem impossible to reach? How do you do more with less? How do you win when you don't have superior numbers or superior firepower? These were real problems that military leaders had to solve. And they solved them by being creative, by thinking differently, by being willing to try things that seemed crazy or impossible, by being willing to fail and learn from failure. That's the real lesson here. That's what applies to modern life. That's what applies to business. That's what applies to technology. That's what applies to everything. When you have a problem that seems impossible to solve, you need to think creatively. You need to be willing to try unconventional solutions. You need to be willing to fail and learn. You need to trust your team. You need to adapt when things don't work. That's what these World War II soldiers did, and it worked. They changed the course of history. The reason these raids are still studied in military academies around the world is because they teach important lessons that go way beyond warfare. They teach lessons about human nature, about what humans are capable of when they're motivated, about what teams can accomplish when they trust each other, about what's possible when you're willing to think differently. Let's think about some specific examples. The soldiers who dressed as fishermen and attacked that German position. What they did was basically a con. They used deception. They used the enemy's assumptions against them. The enemy assumed a fishing boat was a fishing boat. The soldiers used that assumption as a weapon. That's clever. That's creative thinking under pressure. That's the kind of thinking that leads to success in any field. The submarine commandos who swam into enemy harbors, they had to overcome fear. They had to overcome doubt. They had to overcome the fact that what they were doing seemed impossible. But they trained. They prepared. They trusted their training, and they accomplished the mission. That's a lesson about preparation, about how preparation builds confidence, about how confidence leads to success. The kayak soldiers. They proved that conventional thinking is often wrong. Conventional thinking said you need big ships to sink ships. They proved you could sink ships with kayaks. Conventional thinking said you need massive forces to win battles. They proved small teams could win. Conventional thinking said you need expensive equipment. They proved you could use cheap equipment if you were creative. Every time conventional thinking said something was impossible, they proved it was possible. This is what makes studying history so important. When you study history, you're not just learning about what happened in the past. You're learning about human beings. You're learning about how people solve problems. You're learning about what's possible. You're learning that many things that seem impossible are actually possible if you approach them creatively. The soldiers in these raids were ordinary people. Most of them didn't grow up dreaming of becoming commandos. Most of them didn't have special training as kids. They were regular people who were put in extraordinary situations and rose to the occasion. They were plumbers and shopkeepers and students and farmers who became warriors. And that's important because it means that the capability to do extraordinary things exists in ordinary people. It exists in you. It exists in everyone. The question isn't whether you're capable of doing extraordinary things. The question is whether you're in a situation that demands it and whether you have the courage to try. That's what separates people who do extraordinary things from people who don't. Not talent, not intelligence, courage and willingness to try. These World War II raids teach us that. They teach us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. They teach us that innovation comes from necessity. They teach us that small teams can accomplish big things. They teach us that creativity beats resources. They teach us that speed can overcome strength. They teach us that working together is more important than individual skill. And these lessons apply to every field. In business, creativity beats capital sometimes. In technology, innovation beats resources sometimes. In sports, teamwork beats individual talent sometimes. In education, the willingness to learn beats raw intelligence sometimes. In life in general, persistence beats luck sometimes. The lessons from these World War II raids apply everywhere. Think about the famous tech companies. Apple started in a garage with 2 guys and not much money. Google started as a research project at a university. Facebook started in a dorm room. These companies succeeded because they were creative. Because they were willing to do things differently. Because they were willing to take risks. That's the same mentality that led to the kayak raids and the fishing boat raids. It's the same mentality that led to submarines being used to transport commandos. Think about innovation in medicine. Penicillin was discovered by accident. The polio vaccine was developed by people who were determined to find a solution. The COVID vaccine was developed in record time because of creativity and determination and people willing to work together. These are examples of the same principle. People facing a problem and figuring out a creative solution. That's what makes these World War II raids so important and so worth studying. They're not just military history. They're examples of human potential. They're examples of what's possible when people are motivated and creative and willing to work together. They're examples that apply to everything in life. Now let's think about what would have happened if these raids hadn't worked. If Operation Harpoon had failed, Malta would have fallen. If the fishing boat raid had failed, the German position would have been secure. If the submarine commandos had been caught, that whole tactic would have been exposed. If the rat run hadn't worked, American soldiers would have had to retreat. If the kayak raids hadn't worked, they would have been written off as a crazy idea. But they did work. And because they worked, they changed everything. They became standard practice. They were copied by other countries. They led to the development of new military units and new military strategies. They led to the creation of special forces. They led to the modernization of navies around the world. What this tells us is that one success can change everything. One person with a good idea can change the course of history. One small unit that proves that something is possible can lead to that idea becoming standard practice everywhere. That's powerful. That's important to understand. In business, one person with a good idea can start a company that changes the world. In science, one experiment that works can lead to a breakthrough that benefits millions of people. In sports, one player who plays the game differently can change how the entire sport is played. One success can cascade into bigger and bigger changes. But to get that one success, you have to be willing to try. You have to be willing to take a risk. You have to be willing to attempt something that might fail. You have to be willing to look stupid if it doesn't work. That's what the World War II soldiers did. That's what every innovator does.